Jason and Hannah's first meeting felt like something straight out of a movie. He was a young, driven financial analyst, determined to climb the corporate ladder. She was captivating, self-assured, magnetic, and carrying an air of mystery that made it seem like she always knew more than she let on. From the very beginning, Jason was drawn to her in a way he couldn't quite explain. Hannah wasn't like the other women he had dated. There was something more intense about her, a confidence that came with experience, a certainty in the way she carried herself. He found that irresistible. During their time together, she only shared bits and pieces about her past, always mentioning them offhandedly, as if none of it really mattered. And Jason, being deeply in love, never felt the need to press her for more. What did it matter, anyway? The past was the past. Their wedding came quickly, fueled by a bond that felt unshakable. 2 years later, life was good. They had a cozy home, intimate candlelit dinners on weekends, and spontaneous road trips that kept things exciting. Jason was certain he had found the perfect partner. Then came the job offer, a transfer to Hannah's hometown. For him, it was an exciting career move, a step up the professional ladder. For her, it was a homecoming. First, everything went smoothly. Jason settled into his role at the company's new branch, and Hannah seemed content being back in familiar surroundings. But there was something about her behavior, something subtle, that Jason didn't pick up on immediately. Whenever they were out and about, she would deliberately steer clear of certain areas, her eyes darting around, as if checking to see who might be watching. It was easy to brush off at first, just little things, nothing worth dwelling on. Hannah dismissed his concerns, saying she simply had no interest in running into people from her past, that her life had changed. Jason accepted that explanation without much thought. Everything felt fine until the night of the company party. The event was elegant, set in a lavishly decorated hall, with servers gliding through the crowd offering glasses of champagne. Jason always enjoyed bringing Hannah to these functions. She had a way of commanding attention without even trying. But something was different that night. The moment they walked in, he caught 2 of his employees giving Hannah an odd look. At first, he thought he was imagining things. But then he saw it again. The glances weren't casual. They whispered to each other, exchanged smirks, and even stifled laughter. Jason felt a sudden surge of irritation. He was their boss, and seeing them look at his wife like that made his stomach turn. He had never been the jealous or possessive type, but there was something unsettling about their expressions. It wasn't just admiration or curiosity. It was as if they all knew something he didn't. As if Hannah was more than just his wife in their eyes. He watched her move through the room, picking up a champagne flute and blending effortlessly into the crowd. If she noticed the stares, she gave no indication. Maybe she was choosing to ignore them. Jason tried to push aside the uneasy feeling creeping in, but as the evening went on, he realized it wasn't just those 2 employees. Others were doing the same, throwing glances her way, whispering, sharing quiet laughs. It wasn't paranoia. Something was going on. The party continued, but Jason couldn't shake the feeling. Why was everyone looking at her that way? None of the other executives' wives were getting that kind of attention. He told himself he was overthinking it, but no matter where he looked, he kept catching those same smirks, those same knowing glances. It wasn't friendly. It was as if these people recognized her from before, like Hannah was someone they all knew, and not because she was married to him. That night, back at home, Jason couldn't stop replaying everything in his head. Hannah, on the other hand, seemed completely unbothered. "That was a nice party, huh?" she said casually, pulling off her earrings before flopping onto the couch. Jason hesitated, watching her carefully. Was he making a big deal out of nothing? Did any of it even matter? But the feeling didn't go away. In the days that followed, it grew stronger, like a seed that had been planted in his mind, taking root before he could do anything about it. He didn't want to seem paranoid, but he also couldn't ignore it. At last, Jason decided he couldn't keep ignoring the gnawing suspicion in his mind. While at the office, he made up his mind to pull one of his employees aside for a private chat. He needed answers, needed to hear from someone else what was really behind those glances at the party. That decision would mark the moment everything in his life started to shift. Jason had never been the jealous type. He firmly believed that trust was the cornerstone of any relationship, and he took pride in not being the kind of man who hovered over his wife or let paranoia dictate his actions. But this was different. That party, the looks, the smirks, the hushed conversations. It all felt too deliberate to be a coincidence. The next day, he tried to go about business as usual, answering emails, reviewing reports, sitting through meetings. But no matter how much he tried to focus, his mind kept circling back to the same question. What was behind those looks? Why did his wife seem so familiar to people he had never met before? By midday, he gave up the pretense of ignoring it. He glanced around the office, his eyes settling on Andrew, one of his quieter employees. Andrew had been at the party, and if anyone would talk when pressed, it was probably him. Deciding there was no point in waiting, Jason called him in under the guise of discussing a project. At first, he kept it casual, asking about deadlines and deliverables. But then, shifting in his seat, he folded his arms and leveled his gaze at Andrew. "I need to ask you something," he said, his tone turning more serious. "Last night at the party, I noticed you and a few others looking at Hannah, and it wasn't just a simple case of recognition. It was something more." Andrew tensed immediately, shifting in his chair, eyes darting away. "What? No, I don't know what you mean, boss," he stammered. That reaction alone was enough to confirm Jason's worst fears. "Andrew, don't do that. Just be honest with me." Jason pressed, his voice firm. "I saw it. I know something's going on. I need to know what." For a long moment, Andrew said nothing. Then, after letting out a slow, heavy breath, his shoulders slumped like he had finally made up his mind. "Look, boss," he said, his voice low. "I didn't want to be the one to tell you this. But since you're asking, your wife, well, she's kind of known around town." A cold sensation crawled up Jason's spine. His throat tightened. "Known how?" he asked, his voice quieter than he expected. Andrew hesitated again, then, as if deciding there was no point in sugarcoating it, he got straight to the point. "Years ago, Hannah and her ex-fiancé, they had a different kind of lifestyle. They were regulars at swinger parties. Casual get-togethers. That kind of thing." Jason blinked. Once, twice. His mind struggled to process the words. "What?" Andrew exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah. Pretty much everyone around here knows about it. They were, pretty involved, if you get what I mean. It was years ago. Sure. But people around here don't forget." He hesitated before adding, "Hannah had a reputation." Jason felt his heart hammering in his chest. A wave of heat surged through him, followed by an icy chill. His mouth felt dry, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "And why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did no one ever tell me?" Andrew gave him a half-hearted, almost apologetic shrug. "Because nobody wanted to be the one to drop that bomb on you. Up until last night, it seemed like you didn't know. And, well, no one wants to be the guy to break news like that, you know?" Slowly, Jason got to his feet, feeling like the ground beneath him was shifting. He needed to step away, breathe, clear his head. Something. "This was before me," he muttered, more to himself than to Andrew. "Yeah, boss. It was before you," Andrew said. "But around here, her past is common knowledge. Some folks don't forget." Jason didn't even remember how the conversation ended. The world around him felt distant, like he was moving through a fog. Without another word, he left the office, got in his car, and just started driving. No destination, no plan. Just miles of road, the city blurring past as his mind raced. Hannah had never mentioned any of this. Not once. And suddenly, all those little things, the way she avoided certain places, the time she changed the subject when her past came up, the hesitation whenever she spoke about her ex, clicked together like puzzle pieces forming an image he never wanted to see. It all made sense now, and it changed everything. Jason spent the whole day driving aimlessly, unable to stop replaying what he had just learned. By the time he finally pulled into their driveway, The sun had started to dip below the horizon. He sat there for a long time, staring at the front door, his hands gripping the steering wheel. He had no idea how to walk inside and pretend everything was normal. Because nothing was. Not anymore. Jason's chest felt unbearably tight, like he was carrying a weight he never signed up for. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, before finally pushing the door open. The scent of homemade food filled the air. Hannah stood in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, the hum of the radio playing softly in the background. It looked like any other night, but it wasn't. He shut the door a little harder than necessary. Hannah turned at the sound, smiling warmly. "Hey, honey, you're home early." Jason stood there, just watching her, studying her. How could she act so normal, so unaffected? The question escaped his mouth before he could stop it. "Did it never occur to you to tell me?" Her smile faltered. "Tell you what?" He took a few steps forward, tossed his keys onto the table, and folded his arms. "About your past. About what you and your ex used to do in this town." Silence swallowed the room. Hannah set the knife down on the counter, resting her hands on the sink as if she needed a moment to process his words. "Who told you?" she asked, her voice calm but strained, like she was bracing for impact. There was no real surprise in her tone, only resignation. Jason let out a bitter laugh. "Does it matter? The point is, everyone knew. Everyone but me." She turned to face him, arms crossed, mirroring his stance. "I didn't tell you because there was no reason to. It was before you, Jason. Before us." He scoffed, shaking his head. "Before me? You slept with half the damn town, and you figured I just never needed to know." Her eyes narrowed. "Half the town? You're being dramatic." "Am I?" He took a step closer. "Because it sure feels like everywhere I go, someone already knows you in a way I never should have had to deal with." Hannah exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples. "This doesn't change anything between us. I'm still the same person you met, the same woman you married." Jason dragged his hands down his face, his frustration bubbling over. "You don't get it. It's not just about what you did. It's about the fact that I was the only one in the dark. I walked around this town with you, thinking we had a solid marriage, while people were smirking behind my back. Like I was the clueless idiot who didn't get the joke." She tilted her head, eyes cold now. "And what exactly did you expect me to do? Introduce myself by saying, 'Hi, I'm Hannah, and I used to have a wild past?'" Jason clenched his jaw, his anger flaring hotter. "It's not about a wild past, Hannah. You and your ex lived a completely different kind of life, one I had a right to know about before I married you." Her response was quick, sharp. "And what would you have done if you had known?" He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. "Exactly," she said, eyes locked on his. "You would have walked away. That's why I didn't tell you. Because to me it didn't matter. But I knew to you, it would mean everything." The silence between them felt suffocating, thick enough to choke on. Hannah didn't look guilty. She wasn't crying, wasn't pleading for forgiveness. She just stood there, steady, waiting, like whatever happened next was entirely up to him. Maybe it was. Jason didn't sleep that night. He lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, the weight of it all pressing down on him like a boulder. His mind ran in circles, searching for a way to make sense of something that felt impossible to process. At 3 a.m, Hannah was still in the bedroom, probably sleeping just fine. No tossing, no turning, no restless guilt keeping her up. That's what bothered him the most. To her, it was nothing more than a memory, something that didn't matter. But to him, it was like the ground had crumbled beneath his feet, like something vital in their marriage had been ripped away without warning. He had always believed he knew his wife, knew her habits, her quirks, the little details that made her who she was. He knew she drank her coffee without sugar but always with a pinch of cinnamon. He knew she could only fall asleep on her left side. He knew she had an irrational fear of thunder. He knew she hated leaving the bed unmade. But he hadn't known this. And now he wasn't sure if he really knew her at all. He had always believed he knew everything about the woman he loved. Every habit, every quirk, every detail that made her her. But now it felt like he had never truly known her at all. That thought clung to him like a shadow. Who was Hannah? She left for work the next morning without much conversation. No argument, no pleading, just a brief look, a small nod, as if silently giving him space to process everything. But time did nothing to help. If anything, the more he thought about it, the deeper he sank into his own thoughts. As the day stretched on, Jason realized something unsettling: how selective the human mind can be. Just last night, he had still loved Hannah. He had still wanted her, still believed she was the woman he had chosen to spend his life with. If he had never uncovered this secret, nothing would have changed. He would have kept loving her just the same. But now that he knew, everything felt different. Her presence in the house, the way she moved, the way she touched him, even the sound of her voice, none of it had changed. And yet, everything had. It made no sense. It was irrational, but it was real. He tried to convince himself that it didn't matter. Hannah had never cheated on him. She hadn't done anything like that since they'd been together. That wasn't the problem. The problem was the lie. If she could hide something this big for 2 years, what else was she keeping from him? Then came the question he dreaded. If he had never found out, would he still love her the same way? The answer was painfully obvious. Yes. And that was what tormented him the most. That night, he didn't wait for Hannah to come home. He left first. He needed space, air, something to make sense of the storm in his head. He drove for hours, the weight of truth pressing down on him like a boulder on his chest. Eventually, he pulled into a quiet bar, ordered a whiskey, then another, and another. But no amount of alcohol could silence the thoughts clawing at him. How many secrets lie beneath the surface of our relationships? And more importantly, could he live with this one? The bar was nearly empty, a handful of people scattered at tables, each lost in their own quiet struggles. Jason sat at the counter, turning his glass in his fingers, watching the amber liquid swirl under the dim glow of the lights. He wasn't the type to drink like this, but tonight he needed something, anything, to dull his thoughts. Still, Hannah's words echoed in his mind. "I'm the same person you met." But was she? Or had he only seen what he wanted to see? If he had never found out, they'd be planning their future right now. Maybe even talking about starting a family. Instead, everything felt tainted. What hurt the most wasn't her past. It was that Hannah didn't seem sorry. She wasn't trying to make things easier. She wasn't softening the blow. She simply accepted her past as something unchangeable, a fact that existed whether he liked it or not. And maybe that was what wounded him the most. A woman slid onto the bar stool beside him and ordered a drink. Jason barely noticed her at first. But then, out of the corner of his eye, blonde hair, a leather jacket, bright red nails. She caught him looking and smiled. "Rough night." Jason let out a bitter laugh. "Something like that." She tilted her head, studying him. "You look like someone trying to make a decision." He swirled his drink, staring at the glass. "And if you're right?" She shrugged. "Then I'd say, if you're thinking about it this hard, you already know the answer." Jason looked up, catching his reflection in the mirror behind the bar. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes. A man who had been trying to run from something he couldn't escape. She was right. He already knew. Without another word, he tossed some cash onto the counter and walked out. By the time he got home, the house was dark except for a single lamp glowing in the living room. Hannah sat on the couch, legs crossed, holding a cup of tea. She glanced up at him, her expression a mix of expectation and exhaustion. "I figured you'd been drinking," she said simply. Jason didn't answer right away. He shrugged off his coat, tossed it over a chair, and just looked at her. The woman he loved. The woman who, until a few days ago, had been everything to him. But now he saw something else. And in that moment he realized the truth. It wasn't Hannah who had changed. It was him. Jason understood that now. And no matter how much he tried to reason with himself, convincing himself that the past didn't define the present, something inside him had cracked. Something that couldn't be put back together. "I can't stay here anymore," he finally said. his voice barely above a whisper. Hannah didn't flinch. She just closed her eyes for a brief moment, as if she'd been expecting those words all along. "I figured you'd say that." Jason felt his chest tighten. A part of him wanted her to fight for him, to beg him to stay, to say something, anything, that could undo all of this, make things go back to the way they were. But Hannah wasn't that kind of woman. She simply took another slow sip of her tea, then set the cup down with a quiet clink. When she looked at him again, her expression was steady. "I don't regret my past, Jason. If you can't live with it, then you should go." His throat tightened. "I wish I could," he admitted. A sad smile touched her lips. "I know." Jason turned, grabbing the suitcase he'd left in the hallway. He didn't know where he was going, only that he couldn't stay. Before stepping out the door, he glanced back at Hannah one last time. And at that moment, he realized something gut-wrenching. He still loved her. But sometimes, love isn't enough. He shut the door behind him, leaving not just a house, but a part of himself that he would never get back. That night, as he walked down the empty streets, Jason learned a brutal truth. Some things, no matter how much you want them to, can never be undone. The first few days were a blur. Jason checked into a hotel, moving through life in a haze. His nights were restless, spent staring at the ceiling. His days dragged endlessly, every attempt to distract himself falling flat. He tried working, but every time he picked up his phone, his thoughts drifted. Hannah's name was everywhere, even when it wasn't. He kept telling himself that time would dull the pain, that distance would bring clarity. But it didn't. If anything, each night away from her only made the emptiness grow. Then, late one evening, the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He didn't want a life without Hannah. Love had never been the problem. The love was still there, whole, untouched. The real problem was this town. The memories clinging to every street corner, the whispers behind his back, the way people looked at him like he was the last one to get the joke. The past wasn't just Hannah's. It had become his, too. And maybe, just maybe, the only way forward was to leave it all behind. The next morning, Jason made his choice. Hannah opened the door to find him standing there. She didn't say a word at first, just folded her arms, waiting. Jason took a deep breath. "I love you," he said. "I never stopped loving you." Her eyes flickered downward for a moment, but she didn't smile. "But," she said, prompting him to continue. He swallowed hard. "I can't live here, Hannah. I can't walk around this town feeling like I'm constantly being reminded of something I was never a part of." She gave a small nod, like she had already known where this was leading. "I know." Jason took a step closer, reaching for her hand. "I don't want to lose you," he admitted, "but I need to leave this place, and I want you to come with me." For the first time in days, her expression shifted. There was something new in her eyes, a quiet relief, as if she had been waiting for a way out too. "Then let's go." Jason blinked, caught off guard by how quickly she answered. "You really want to?" She let out a soft breath, then finally allowed a faint smile. "I asked for a transfer 2 days ago," she said. "The company approved it." Her words sent a rush of warmth through him. "So," he started, but she cut him off. "Then we start over," she said simply. "Somewhere far from here." 6 weeks later, they arrived in a new city, a place where no one knew Hannah, where no one looked at Jason like they knew something he didn't. The past still existed. It always would. But here it didn't define them, because in this new place, the only past that mattered was the one they were building together.